So then we are back with the more understandings from the time of the Second Tabernacle services, where we find in the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of the Tzayelic lineage. So then we can understand the time of the end as per Yirmiyahu the prophet. We find layers of understanding of the spring feast, the autumn feast, and also the returning of the cities of the Messiah laid waste for many centuries. As we read then Yirmiyahu and we layer them with Daniel, we find these layers then related with the time of the end, such as then the time of the vengeance or autumn feast, then precisely in the 65th chapter of Yirmiyahu, sections of the 66th chapter, and then Daniel 11 and 12. Daniel then, let's study his personal life because he was involved with then kings of his time, extremely important, because Daniel then, he came from the Holy Land. He had to make a very long walk from the Holy Land until Babylon, and then he had joined up with his friends, and then later he was then selected for a very important position. Daniel then was not only a person understanding then prophecies, but he was involved with then the prophecies of the Gentiles mostly. Yirmiyahu, however, he was then involved with his time, the political situation of his time, tabernacling of his time, and also the restoration period, and then the autumn feast. Daniel then, Ezekiel, his contemporary, he then, as Daniel and then the other Ezekiel, imagine then the prophecies of Yirmiyahu having a ramification. Try to understand as Yirmiyahu a pole, and then branches coming out of this pole, and then extending the understanding from the main stem. This is kind of what went on. Daniel, however, as he was then given knowledge, understanding, and wisdom, what did he do? He was then in charge of then obviously interpreting the dreams. He was then in charge of the religious aspect of future, and then as he was exercising his position, he was giving favor as far as trading with the neighboring nations, and then from faraway nations also. So then, during this time where we are experiencing the last time or last trade of the time of the end, the trade system, we then, as tracing back what Daniel had experienced, what we then are yet experiencing and prior of the main coming of the last time system or then the last day system, Daniel had experienced it. Let's then evaluate what Daniel was doing. As he was then year after year after year after year, he was gathering knowledge of the trade. He did understand that the first son, Ishmael, had then the understanding of the trade because he was a king. He did understand that the first anointing, because of Ibrahim, was granted the position of traders. As he was gathering this knowledge year after year, he became then so great at it. Then what went on was, as the Creator gave him knowledge and wisdom, he did understand what he was doing so fastly was then in the future a knowledge of the same type of understanding of Daniel would be coming then a whole lot faster. So then let's make a retrospective. There was Daniel working under many kings. It is true that Babylon was an empire, but they had their problems. Daniel, however, was placed there for a very important position. He was obviously a trader, a person making trade, and he was given then, at this point, the understandings of the time of the end. However, as he was then explaining, for instance, the layer of Daniel 12, and makes then a layer with Yeshayahu, the 65th chapter, then you begin your quest, understanding what went on as far as trade. For instance, note, credit, those were very known during the time of Daniel. In the trade and credit from nation to nation in parcels, Daniel the prophet was very acquainted. However, there was a limited velocity of those transactions. When Daniel wrote, the knowledge would increase. He was not talking only the knowledge itself, he was talking the velocity of the system. What Daniel was doing was then extremely similar of what we are about to experience. However, the velocity of it much faster. There was a sort of credit system at the time. There were notes of credit. There were trades amongst themselves done via a system. When Daniel knew that the system the Creator gave him would be then the very top of his time, then he was given, knowledge would increase, simply speaking of the system Daniel was dealing with, but a whole lot faster and a whole lot more volume. This makes our study extremely simple. So then, what he was teaching was so famous that as he was teaching his people regarding the star, the trades practices from the time of Daniel until when the Messiah came, they were being practiced. Thus, what Daniel started back then, roughly 500 years earlier, they were practicing on the land, and then his descendants were able to maintain those kinds of trade from the time of Daniel, and then they were able to bring those riches. At the time then the Messiah and his family, they were leaving the area and then going to the hiding place. So then it is very important making this very simple. And the knowledge, it's not truly new understandings. It is simply making faster. And obviously because of it would bring a whole lot more trade. So then, as we read then the 12th chapter, and we then are aware of this fact, teaches us whatsoever we must experience in the very near future. We are speaking of not even 36 months. Daniel already knew back then. Let's put it this way. The flow of trades events coming in the next 36 months, this absolutely certainly the flow of events of trade, those were known back then. The only distinction of what Daniel was doing versus our time is the velocity of transactions. The rest of it Daniel was aware of. So the translator of Daniel, when he translated from the original manuscripts, it's not truly knowledge that was then the core of the understanding of the layer. It's not truly knowledge, it's the velocity. As we can understand, infrastructure at the time was then of a such level of technological velocity. Daniel simply did understand. In the future, it would be nearly exactly how he was doing, but faster. The word nearly because at the time of Daniel, those transactions were done by hand. Though there were counting machines back then, there were counting machines. So then, as we read then Daniel, as far as line of credit, transactions of monetary systems, transactions of value of coins, in many other aspects of interest, payments, Daniel knew it. The only situation that was then cumbersome back during the time of Daniel, it was then the timing that it was taking. Let's then have this perspective. Daniel was very concerned with then the 11th chapter and then the base of the statue. But then, as he was aware of the time of the seat, the time of the rebuilding of the holy cities, and Daniel had a copy of the manuscripts of Yirmiyahu, explaining then the ending of the 70 years captivity, because the nation did not maintain the yearly Shabbat and the land must rest as per instructions. So they were kicked out of the land, so then the land was resting for the specific time. But Daniel knew it. So this makes the reading extremely important and interesting as we then are preparing ourselves for the visit in Brazil. Brazil truly is improving slowly but surely. The political situation is very precarious. There are many defects in the government. Lots of politicians that take advantage of. But Brazil is improving in the areas of security, the upgrading of systems, and then the basic water quality. The police force is being increased, and the equipment is being upgraded. So you find then weapons being used by the police, and fortunately we can expect then vehicles being more powerful, and the system of driver's license being updated and then making computerized, so then the police cars can have computers in their cars. So the situation is truly improving. The main problem is then having these politicians involved with live television while debating amongst themselves, so then the nation can start learning more. Because Brazil is the most resourceful country of South America. As the system then restarts, such as then the BRICS Bank. The BRICS Bank is the very core of what Daniel then was explaining of velocity, known as knowledge. The knowledge basis is then obviously related with trade, but then the BRICS is then coming to Brazil, and then in July there are a couple of events. Firstly, then you find the BRICS countries coming and then gathering. The second is the BRICS cable, uniting then Brazil with Portugal. Then you find next month Dragon Mart of China opening up then in Cancun, Mexico. You find then the second Panama Canal being opened also this year or next year. There was a delay because of lack of funding and get the project going, but they were able to get around it, and either this year or next year. So then there are lots of situations lining up. So then what Daniel has said regarding knowledge then is truly coming towards us. And the velocity of what Daniel then was expecting is then what we understand as knowledge shall increase. So let's then be hopeful for this July. It's only a few months away, and expecting then Dragon Mart opening up then in Cancun, Mexico next year will to bring a whole lot more trade for South America and Central America. Let's expect then more from Daniel as far as the 11th and the 12th. And then, understandably, as far as we can say regarding the acts of the Spirit, let's be sure we understand there were many other Megillas available during the time. These Megillas, lots of them were related also with the trade, and there were many. You find then during the time of the 1,000 years of the Messiah, when he ascended until 1009 from the regular calendar, what Daniel had explained and what went on during his time was exercised during the 1,000 years of the Messiah. Then whatsoever Daniel had done was then carbon copied. Then later on came the time of deceit, and then we are back on schedule, and then we are obviously carbon copying what Daniel had done, the 1,000 years of the Messiah, the directives from the holy cities, and the holy cities return, and then the trade lining up itself once again. Later we study more then of these, and then lining up with Yirmiyahu also, because Yirmiyahu knew of this fact, and he is displayed then in the 62nd chapter. And there is a layer over there related with then the restoration of the beauty of trade. So please stay tuned, much more coming up.